Hi there, it's Amy D with Amy D Coaching, and today we're going to talk about appraisals and keeping a level head when your appraisal comes in low. So first and foremost, the most important thing is to understand what your contract in your state says about appraisals and what your appraisal contingency actually is. Here in Oregon, our appraisal contingency basically says that if the home doesn't appraise, the buyer and seller have a certain amount of time to figure out a solution, or the transaction automatically terminates and earnest money is refunded to the buyer. So it's important to understand what your agreement is before you even start thinking about what do we do with this low appraisal. Now, a trend in our state over the last several months or so, with the way the market has been, a trend has been people have been waiving their appraisal contingency. And it's important to look at the language on that too, because sometimes the waiving of it just means that if it doesn't appraise, then the buyer backs out, then now they're not getting their earnest money back. You cannot force a buyer to buy a property. The buyer can always terminate. The question is just, do they receive their earnest money back or not? Now, terminating is usually the last thing you want to do, but it's important to understand what the agreement says, and that's actually what the agreement says. Now, in most cases, terminating is not what we want to do, and there's where your motivation is to keep the transaction together, regardless of who would get the earnest money if this transaction didn't come together. Because neither the buyer nor the seller wants the earnest money. They want the transaction to move forward. So oftentimes buyers kind of panic because they suddenly feel like, oh gosh, we're paying too much, it's not worth what we offered, and that's really not the case at all. So market value is defined by what a willing buyer, a reasonably motivated buyer and a reasonably motivated seller are willing to buy and sell for. That's what market value is by definition. And so if you're in an area like here where often there's multiple offers and sometimes we get into contract well above the asking price, if there were other buyers willing to pay what you have offered or right in that same ballpark, you're not overpaying. The market is elevated due to just basic supply and demand. The purpose of the appraisal is not for the buyer or seller. It's to protect the bank, to make sure that the bank can get, the bank's concern is, what if you default on your loan and we end up owning that house? Can we sell it for what we're loaning to you? And the bank doesn't want to own the house. They want to do the loan. They want the loan to perform. That's their asset. So the appraisal is to protect the bank. It doesn't have anything to do with the players here or the actual market value. The appraised value is something completely different, and it's important to keep that in mind. And that you still have a contract between the buyer and the seller. Now both parties have motivations to keep it moving forward, or sometimes they don't. If the seller had other offers and say they've got a backup offer and there's other buyers still willing to pay about what you're in contract with, or at least above wherever the appraisal came in, and if this was a conventional loan, the seller might be of the mind that's like, you need to kind of shore up the difference or we're going to go with someone else, especially if they're not in a hurry to get out of there. Now, the overwhelming majority of the time, the agreed upon closing date is important to the seller. They don't want to start over with a new buyer and wait another 30 to 45 days. But if they're in that position and you're the buyer, you might need to figure out a way to bridge this gap. And that's frustrating. You're really not overpaying if there's somebody else willing to pay that amount. Now, if you had a VA loan or an FHA loan, that appraisal will stick with the home for 6 months. So the seller doesn't have the option, even if they had a backup offer if that person was also VA or FHA, they really don't have the option of now selling it to them at the higher price, because your appraisal will stick with the property. So these are so just understanding all the different moving parts and understanding your position will help you understand your options, and most importantly, just try to keep a level head. Realize that this isn't, nobody wanted the appraisal to come in low. It's not the seller's fault. It's not your fault. It just is what it is, and it's a hurdle that you need to overcome if you still want the house. If you decide you don't want the house and you have your appraisal contingency and it hasn't been waived, then often you can walk away, get your earnest money back, unless the seller disputes it. You can't guarantee. There's disputed earnest money. Different states handle that differently. But oftentimes at that point, what you need to realize is you spent money on the appraisal, on the inspection. You're not going to get any of that money back. So it might be worth it to figure out a way to stay in the transaction. A low appraisal does not obligate the seller to come down to the appraisal value and sell the home at that price, although I have seen things unfold in that manner as well. So if you'd like more information on this, go ahead and give me a call, info@amyd.com, or comment in the comments below some strategies you've used in the past.